In the early morning hours of December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes forest was already imposing limits before the first German artillery rounds landed. Snow covered secondary roads. Fog reduced visibility to a few hundred meters. Forested ridgelines compressed movement into valleys where only paved roads could support sustained traffic. For armored forces, the terrain did not merely complicate advance. It dictated it. The German offensive, Operation Walk am Rhein, relied on a narrow window of operational freedom. The plan assumed rapid penetration by formations such as the 2nd Panzer Division, 116th Panzer Division, and Panzerlehr, pushing west through the Losheim Gap, across the Auer and Klurf rivers, toward the Meuse. Speed was not a preference. It was a requirement imposed by fuel calculations, bridge capacities, and the expectation that Allied command would be temporarily disoriented. On the American side, the Ardennes sector was thinly held. Divisions like the 106th Infantry Division and elements of the 28th Infantry Division occupied extended fronts with limited depth. Fortifications were incomplete. There were no continuous trench systems, no layered mine belts, no concrete anti-tank obstacles. By doctrinal standards, the defense appeared porous, even negligent. Some German officers later described it as non-existent. That assessment ignored the primary constraint shaping both sides: road dependency. In the Ardennes, armored movement without roads was functionally impossible. Forest density restricted off-road maneuver. Frozen ground limited recovery operations. Slopes exceeded the safe lateral limits for tracked vehicles, especially Panther and Panzer IV tanks with high centers of gravity. Any advance, regardless of unit strength, collapsed into column movement along a small number of paved routes. American defensive planning at the local level exploited this. The so-called impossible defense line was never intended as a continuous front. It existed as a sequence of force decision points: road junctions, village choke points, bridge approaches, and defile where armor could not disperse. Officers on the ground, lacking resources for a traditional defense, instead designed positions that maximized the consequences of delay. The first technical anchor was vehicle immobilization. At multiple points east of St. Vith, American anti-tank guns, primarily 57mm M1 pieces, were positioned not for optimal engagement range, but to cover narrow road segments where a single disabled vehicle would block the entire column. In frozen conditions, a knocked-out lead tank could not be pushed aside. Shoulder widths were insufficient. Ditches were too deep and iced over. Recovery vehicles were rare and exposed to fire. Once a column stopped, the system began to fail forward. German armor doctrine assumed fluid movement and bypass. In the Ardennes, bypass routes did not exist. Infantry units assigned to screen the flanks were forced into frontal clearing actions against small American detachments equipped with bazookas and M1 rifles. Weapons insufficient for decisive destruction, but effective at creating uncertainty. Each pause consumed fuel at idle. Each delay disrupted synchronization between armor, infantry, and artillery. Fuel was the second anchor, and it was unforgiving. Many German units entered the offensive with fuel loads calculated to reach specific objectives, assuming capture of Allied depots along the way. The 2nd Panzer Division, advancing towards Celle, quickly exceeded its planned consumption due to stop-and-go movement and detours forced by blocked roads. Fuel trucks, themselves restricted to the same road network, became trapped behind combat elements. Once separated, they could not move forward under fire. By December 18th, traffic congestion behind the leading German spearheads extended for kilometers. Artillery units could not redeploy forward because prime movers were immobilized. Command vehicles were delayed. Radio coordination degraded as units operated on outdated assumptions of position and timing. The offensive mass that was supposed to overwhelm American defenses instead compressed itself into vulnerable, static formations. American command initially struggled to understand the pattern. Reports from units like the 7th Armored Division and remnants of the 106th Infantry Division described enemy breakthroughs occurring simultaneously with enemy paralysis. Villages such as St. Vith and later Bastogne gained operational importance not because of symbolic value, but because they sat astride multiple road axes. Holding them imposed disproportionate delay on German movement. The defense line, mocked in planning stages as impossible, functioned precisely because it did not attempt to be complete. It did not stop every tank. It did not hold every mile. It converted time into a weapon by forcing armored forces to operate at densities and tempos they could not sustain. As weather began to clear after December 23rd, Allied air power returned. But by then, the outcome was already structurally determined. German armor, short on fuel and constrained by terrain, could no longer exploit its initial gains. Air attacks did not create failure. They exposed it. The panzer attacks in the Ardennes were halted not by a wall, but by a system of limits that turned movement itself into a liability. The continuation of the German advance after December 19th, 1944 exposed a third constraint that planners had underestimated: bridge load capacity. The Ardenne River network, particularly the Our, Clerf, and Wiltz, was crossed by civilian bridges rated for peacetime traffic, not sustained armored flow. Many could not safely support the weight of a Panther or a fully loaded Panzer IV without reinforcement. Engineer units were tasked with strengthening crossings under fire, a process measured in hours, sometimes days. Each delay compounded the congestion already forming behind the spearheads. American engineers understood this vulnerability. In several sectors, bridges were destroyed not to stop the lead elements, but to trap following units on the wrong side of the river. A single blown crossing forced detours of tens of kilometers over secondary roads already clogged with traffic. Detours consumed fuel at rates far exceeding planning estimates. The German timetable, already fragile, lost coherence. At the tactical level, this translated into fragmented engagements. German units arrived piecemeal, stripped of artillery support and with limited infantry coordination. Tanks advanced into villages without proper reconnaissance, encountering American teams equipped with M1A1 bazookas, M9 launchers, and improvised obstacles. Again, the objective was not destruction. It was stoppage. The Americans themselves operated under severe limitations. Ammunition shortages were common. Units such as Combat Command B, 7th Armored Division, fought while partially encircled near St. Vith, relying on rationed artillery fires and pre-registered defensive zones. The technical anchor here was fire control capacity. Limited communications meant artillery could not be shifted dynamically. Defensive fires were planned to deny roads, not open terrain. This further reinforced the logic of node-based defense. As pressure mounted, German command attempted to restore momentum by committing reserves. Elements of Panzerlehr were redirected to exploit perceived gaps. This decision introduced another constraint: unit density. The Ardennes road network could not accommodate simultaneous movement by multiple armored divisions without catastrophic congestion. The commitment of additional forces did not increase combat power at the front. It increased paralysis behind it. By December 21st, German fuel shortages reached critical levels. Abandoned vehicles became common sights along advance routes. Some tanks were destroyed by their crews after running dry, not to deny capture, but because recovery was impossible. Fuel scarcity forced commanders to choose between advancing a few tanks forward or maintaining cohesion. Neither option restored operational freedom. The American response became increasingly systematic. Reinforcements, including elements of the 101st Airborne Division, were directed to road hubs rather than front lines. Bastogne exemplified this approach. Its encirclement did not remove its operational value. As long as American forces controlled the town, German armor was denied access to multiple westbound routes. The technical anchor was road network centrality. Losing Bastogne would have reopened maneuver options. Holding it preserved delay. German attempts to bypass Bastogne failed for the same reasons as earlier efforts. Off-road movement was infeasible. Secondary roads could not support sustained traffic. Each bypass attempt fragmented units further, increasing exposure to air attack once skies cleared. At the strategic level, the Ardennes offensive was collapsing under its own assumptions. The German high command had planned for friction. They had not planned for systemic saturation. Roads, fuel, bridges, and command networks were all pushed beyond tolerances simultaneously. There was no single point of failure to correct. The system failed as a whole. American counterattacks beginning after December 26th did not reverse the offensive so much as formalize its end. German units, now largely immobile, could not respond coherently. What followed was withdrawal under pressure, constrained by the same terrain and infrastructure that had limited the advance. The so-called impossible defense line was never drawn on a map as a single entity. It emerged from an understanding that in the Ardennes, armored warfare was governed less by firepower than by physics. Roads limited mass, fuel limited time, bridges limited weight. When these limits aligned, even the most aggressive offensive could be brought to a halt without decisive battles. The Ardennes campaign demonstrated that defensive success did not require continuous occupation of terrain. It required control over the conditions that made movement possible at all. As the German withdrawal began to take shape in the final days of December 1944, another constraint asserted itself, one that had been present from the beginning but had remained secondary while momentum still existed. It was command latency. German operational control relied on a hierarchical flow of orders that assumed predictable movement rates and stable unit locations. In the Ardennes, neither condition held. Units advanced, halted, rerouted, and stalled in patterns that no longer matched operational maps. By the time updated reports reached Corps and Army headquarters, the information was already obsolete. Orders issued in response often arrived after the conditions they were meant to address had changed. This delay was not merely bureaucratic. Radio traffic increased as units attempted to compensate for uncertainty. Frequencies became congested. Signal vehicles, restricted to the same roads as combat units, could not reposition freely to restore coverage. In wooded terrain, line-of-sight limitations further degraded communications. The system began to operate with partial awareness, a state in which decisions were technically informed but practically misaligned. American command, by contrast, benefited from a simpler operational requirement. They were not attempting to coordinate rapid exploitation. Their objective was denial. Local commanders were authorized to hold, delay, or withdraw based on immediate conditions without waiting for detailed higher-level approval. This asymmetry in command flexibility became decisive as the battle shifted from movement to containment. A further technical anchor emerged in the form of maintenance capacity. German armored vehicles entering the Ardennes were already operating under were accumulated during previous operations. Cold weather increased mechanical failure rates. Lubricants thickened. Batteries lost charge. Track pins became brittle. Maintenance units, positioned far behind the front, could not reach immobilized vehicles without clearing congested roads. Repairs that would have been routine in rear areas became impossible at the front. Each breakdown removed not just a vehicle, but a segment of road capacity. Disabled tanks often had to be destroyed in place to clear minimal passage. This reduced available combat power while simultaneously degrading mobility for remaining units. The offensive, already short on fuel, now began to lose vehicles to mechanical attrition unrelated to enemy fire. American forces experienced similar environmental stress, but their vehicles operated closer to supply and repair facilities. Shorter internal lines allowed damaged equipment to be evacuated and returned to service. The difference was not technological superiority, but logistical geometry. As January approached, German units attempting to disengage encountered the same structural limits in reverse. Withdrawal required coordination, fuel, and open routes, resources already exhausted. Retreating columns became vulnerable to artillery and air attack precisely because they could not disperse. What had once been an offensive mass now functioned as a liability. At the doctrinal level, the Ardennes exposed a mismatch between German armored theory and operational reality. The doctrine assumed that once breakthrough occurred, operational depth would absorb friction. In the Ardennes, depth did not exist in a usable form. Terrain compressed operations into a shallow corridor where every delay propagated backward through the system. The American defense did not defeat the offensive by matching it symmetrically. It defeated it by refusing symmetry altogether. Rather than contesting strength with strength, it contested feasibility. Every decision imposed by terrain, weather, or infrastructure narrowed German options until choice itself disappeared. By the time German commanders recognized that the offensive could no longer achieve its objectives, the system had already passed a point where correction was possible. Adjustments required time. Time required fuel. Fuel required movement. Movement required roads. The chain could not be restored from within. The so-called impossible defense line was therefore not a single act or position. It was an accumulation of constraints deliberately accepted by one side and progressively violated by the other. Its effectiveness lay not in stopping motion outright, but in ensuring that every attempt to restore motion consumed resources faster than they could be replaced. In the Ardennes, armored warfare reached a point where continuation itself became unsustainable, not because of defeat in battle, but because the environment enforced limits that doctrine could not override. As the engagement moved into January 1945, the character of the fighting shifted again, revealing a final constraint that had been implicit throughout the campaign: irreversibility. By this stage, German forces were no longer operating within a flexible operational framework. Decisions made during the first days of the offensive, routes chosen, fuel consumed, vehicles abandoned, bridges destroyed, could not be undone. There was no reserve of time or material with which to correct earlier assumptions. Every action taken now was conditioned by cumulative loss, not current intent. This was most evident in the redeployment attempts of surviving armored units. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division and 116th Panzer Division, ordered to disengage and establish new defensive lines, found that their remaining vehicles could not be concentrated without creating new bottlenecks. The road network that had constrained advance now constrained withdrawal. Narrow routes forced units to move in predictable sequences, exposing them to American artillery fires coordinated by increasingly intact communications networks. American artillery units, many of which had been repositioned during the defensive phase, now operated with greater freedom. The technical anchor here was fire sustainment. Shorter supply lines allowed continuous resupply of ammunition. Guns that had previously rationed shells to deny roads could now shift fires dynamically to disrupt movement. Withdrawal routes became zones of attrition rather than escape. At the same time, Allied air power imposed an additional layer of constraint. With skies clear, fighter bombers attacked columns that could not disperse. Vehicles were destroyed, not primarily for their tactical value, but for their obstructive effect. A single burning truck or tank was often enough to halt an entire movement sequence. The logic of immobilization, previously applied defensively, now operated offensively. The German command structure attempted to impose order through reorganization. Ad hoc battle groups were formed from remnants of shattered units. While tactically flexible, these formations lacked standardized logistics and maintenance support. Fuel types, spare parts, and ammunition were mismatched. The technical anchor here was compatibility. Systems designed to operate within established divisional frameworks could not sustain improvised structures under pressure. Meanwhile, American forces expanded the original defensive logic outward. Counterattacks were planned not to recapture territory indiscriminately, but to sever remaining road links and compress German units into increasingly confined areas. Terrain once again dictated outcomes. Forests limited maneuver. Rivers fixed axis. Roads determined feasibility. The operational picture that emerged bore little resemblance to the initial German plan. What had been conceived as a rapid penetration toward the Meuse had devolved into a series of localized withdrawals constrained by the same factors that had halted the advance. There was no decisive moment of collapse. Instead, there was a steady erosion of capability until further action became meaningless. At a broader level, the Ardennes campaign demonstrated how modern warfare could be decided without the destruction of an enemy's core forces. German armored units were not annihilated in large encirclements. They were neutralized by accumulation of delays, shortages, mechanical failures, and command errors, each individually survivable, collectively decisive. The defense line that had never existed as a continuous structure achieved its effect precisely because it aligned with the environment. It accepted the Ardennes as it was rather than as doctrine imagined it to be. By doing so, it transformed geography and logistics into active participants in the battle. What remained after the fighting subsided was not a clear front line, but a pattern. Where movement had been forced, resistance had concentrated. Where resistance concentrated, time had been lost. Where time was lost, systems failed. In this sense, the Ardennes did not merely halt an offensive. It exposed the limits of armored warfare when conditions, not commanders, dictated outcomes. By mid-January 1945, the Ardennes had ceased to function as an active operational space and instead became a constraint field, an environment in which neither side could act freely, but where only one side required freedom of movement to succeed. German forces were now operating inside a closed loop of limitation. Fuel allocations were no longer calculated for advance, but for survival. Artillery units fired sparingly, not because targets were scarce, but because resupply could not be guaranteed. Infantry formations moved primarily at night, not to regain surprise, but to avoid air attack on roads that could no longer be abandoned during daylight hours. At this stage, the technical anchor was temporal compression. Every remaining German action required more time to execute than the system could provide. Repositioning a battalion that would normally take hours now took days. The reasons were cumulative: blocked roads, limited fuel, damaged bridges, degraded communications, and exhausted crews. The environment did not merely slow action. It outpaced decision-making. American operations, by contrast, benefited from expanding time margins. With interior lines restored and logistics stabilized, delays no longer carried existential consequences. If a counterattack stalled, it could be paused, reinforced, or redirected without threatening the integrity of the system. Time functioned asymmetrically, scarce for one side, abundant for the other. This asymmetry reshaped tactical behavior. German units avoided engagement unless withdrawal routes were secured. American units increasingly initiated contact precisely to force German responses that required movement. Fire and maneuver were used less to destroy forces than to compel displacement into terrain that imposed additional constraints. The Ardennes road network, once the enabler of the German offensive, now became a lattice of exposure. Intersections were predictable. Movement schedules could be inferred. Artillery observers no longer needed continuous tracking. They needed only to know where movement must occur. The battlefield became anticipatory rather than reactive. The failure of the offensive did not stem from a single miscalculation, but from the interaction of correct assumptions within an incorrect environment. German planners had accurately assessed Allied dispositions, weather effects on air power, and the potential for surprise. What they underestimated was the degree to which infrastructure, once saturated, would cease to function as a medium of maneuver. American defenders, operating initially under inferior conditions, had structured their response around that saturation point. They did not seek to hold terrain permanently. They sought to accelerate system overload, to push German forces past threshold from which recovery was impossible within available time. By late January, the Ardennes front stabilized, not because balance had been restored, but because movement had become too costly to attempt. The terrain enforced equilibrium by denying initiative. What remained was attrition conducted within narrow limits, governed more by logistics than by tactics. The so-called impossible defense line was therefore never a line in the conventional sense. It was a method, one that accepted discontinuity, localized loss, and temporary collapse in exchange for long-term systemic failure on the opposing side. Its success lay in recognizing that modern warfare does not require the denial of ground if it can deny process. In the Ardennes, that denial occurred incrementally. Each blocked road, each delayed column, each abandoned vehicle contributed to a condition in which continuation no longer produced advantage. The offensive did not end when it was stopped. It ended when it could no longer mean anything different regardless of intent. And by the time that realization became unavoidable, the environment itself had already delivered the verdict. What followed after stabilization was not resolution, but residual motion, actions carried out because forces were already committed, not because they could still alter outcomes. German units remaining in the Ardennes continued to maneuver at the margins of feasibility. Small counterattacks were launched to straighten lines or recover tactically exposed positions. These efforts were constrained by a final, often overlooked technical anchor: crew endurance. Armored crews had operated for weeks in sub-zero temperatures with limited rest, inadequate shelter, and irregular supply. Fatigue reduced reaction time. Maintenance errors increased. Navigation mistakes became common, especially at night, when maps no longer reflected passable routes. Fatigue did not cause defeat, but it removed resilience. Systems already operating near failure thresholds could no longer absorb additional stress. American forces exploited this condition indirectly. Rather than pressing for rapid breakthroughs, they maintained pressure along predictable axes, forcing German units to remain alert and mobile when neither alertness nor mobility could be sustained. Even limited probes required fuel expenditure, vehicle startup cycles, and exposure to air and artillery observation. Each action incurred costs that could not be recovered. At the Corps and Army level, German command attempted to extract usable lessons in real time. Reports emphasized bravery, localized success, and temporary penetration. What they could not correct was the underlying structural reality. The Ardennes had transformed from a maneuver space into a consumption space, where every movement consumed more capability than it generated. American command, observing the same battlefield, reached the opposite conclusion. The environment now favored containment over pursuit. Efforts focused on restoring supply lines, rotating exhausted units, and consolidating road control. These actions did not produce dramatic battlefield moments, but they increased systemic stability. The disparity widened. The technical anchor governing this phase was replacement throughput. American units received personnel, vehicles, and supplies at rates sufficient to offset losses. German units did not. Even when replacements arrived, they lacked cohesion with depleted formations. Training standards varied. Equipment compatibility issues persisted. Integration consumed time the system no longer had. As February approached, the Ardennes ceased to be a focal point of initiative. It became a cautionary reference embedded in planning documents and after-action reports, not as a failure of courage or planning discipline, but as an example of what occurred when operational ambition exceeded environmental tolerance. The so-called impossible defense line never required reinforcement or formal recognition. Its function had already been fulfilled. It had converted an offensive designed for exploitation into a sequence of irreversible commitments. Each commitment reduced options. Each reduction increased dependency on conditions that no longer existed. In this sense, the Ardennes demonstrated a form of defensive success that left little visible trace. No continuous fortifications remained. No decisive battlefield markers defined the moment of victory. What persisted was absence, the absence of movement, of choice, of recoverable momentum. The battle did not conclude when German forces withdrew to earlier positions. It concluded when the environment ceased to permit any alternative course of action. From that point forward, remaining operations were procedural, governed by inertia rather than intent. This outcome did not invalidate armored doctrine. It revealed its boundaries. In the Ardennes, those boundaries were enforced not by opposing firepower alone, but by the interaction of terrain, infrastructure, logistics, and time, elements that did not negotiate, adapt, or respond to leadership. They imposed conditions, and once imposed, those conditions defined everything that followed. By the final weeks of February 1945, the Ardennes no longer functioned as a battlefield in the analytical sense. It functioned as a resolved system, one in which outcomes were already embedded in prior constraints, and remaining actions merely traced the shape of that resolution. German units still present in the region were no longer organized for maneuver. They were organized for avoidance. Positions were selected not for tactical advantage, but for shelter from air attack and access to minimal supply routes. Movement occurred primarily to prevent isolation, not to achieve advantage. The technical anchor governing this phase was exposure minimization. Survival depended on reducing visibility, movement signatures, and logistical demand. American forces, meanwhile, operated under a different logic. With strategic initiative firmly established elsewhere, the Ardennes became a secondary concern. Operations were conducted to stabilize, rotate, and prepare for subsequent advances eastward. This introduced a final asymmetry, strategic patience. American units could afford to wait, reorganize, and apply pressure selectively. German units could not afford inaction, but could not afford movement either. This asymmetry erased the last remaining space for meaningful German decision-making. At no point did a single engagement mark the definitive end of resistance in the Ardennes. There was no climactic battle that resolved the campaign. Instead, the offensive dissolved into administrative withdrawal, equipment recovery, and unit reconstitution attempts that never fully succeeded. The system had already dictated the outcome. Human effort could only comply. What made the original defense appear impossible was not its ambition, but its refusal to conform to conventional expectations. It did not promise control. It promised denial. It accepted loss of ground, loss of contact, even loss of coherence at the tactical level, in exchange for predictability at the systemic level. German forces were allowed to advance, but only along paths that ensured their advance would become self-limiting. This approach inverted the traditional relationship between offense and defense. Instead of meeting force with force, it met requirement with constraint. Wherever the German offensive required speed, it encountered delay. Wherever it required mass, it encountered compression. Wherever it required freedom of choice, it encountered forced alternatives. The Ardennes thus demonstrated that modern warfare could be shaped decisively before decisive battles occurred. By the time engagements took place, the outcome had already narrowed to a single trajectory. Combat determined cost, not direction. The legacy of this campaign was not a new doctrine formally articulated at the time. It was a pattern recognized later, that systems under pressure do not fail at their strongest points, but at the intersections where multiple limits coincide. Roads, fuel, weather, maintenance, command latency, each was manageable in isolation. Together, they were decisive. The defense line that never existed on maps existed everywhere conditions overlapped. Even after this point, the consequences continued to unfold along the same structural logic. German armor doctrine, already under strain on multiple fronts, would not again attempt an operation that depended so completely on environmental compliance. The Ardennes became a reference not because it was unique, but because it made visible a principle that had always existed. When systems exceed tolerance, intent becomes irrelevant. And in the winter forests of Western Europe, tolerance had been exceeded long before the last shots were fired. When the Ardennes fighting receded into history, it did not do so as a single lesson clearly stated or immediately absorbed. There was no formal doctrine issued in its aftermath that explained what had occurred in systematic terms. Instead, the campaign lingered as a case study, revisited, reinterpreted, and gradually understood through accumulation rather than declaration. In December 1944, the German command attempted something that had defined its operational identity since the beginning of the war, a decisive maneuver intended to rupture the enemy system faster than it could respond. This approach had succeeded in environments where space absorbed friction, where depth allowed mistakes to be corrected through speed, and where infrastructure could sustain mass long enough for intent to dominate conditions. The Ardennes offered none of those properties. What made the defense effective was not foresight at the strategic level, but alignment at the practical one. American forces did not predict the offensive in detail. They did not possess superior information, superior positioning, or superior readiness at the moment it began. What they possessed, often implicitly rather than consciously, was a defensive logic compatible with the environment in which the offensive would have to operate. That compatibility mattered more than strength. The German offensive depended on a sequence of assumptions that were individually reasonable. Surprise would delay Allied reaction. Poor weather would suppress air power. Armored mass would create momentum. Captured fuel would sustain movement. Roads would serve as conduits rather than constraints. Each assumption, taken alone, could be defended. Taken together, they formed a system that required uninterrupted compliance from terrain, infrastructure, weather, and time. The Ardennes did not comply. The American defense, by contrast, did not depend on a sequence of successes. It depended on thresholds. It did not require every road to be held, every village defended, or every engagement won. It required only that movement slow beyond a critical point, that consumption exceed replenishment, and that delay compound faster than initiative could recover. Once those thresholds were crossed, the outcome no longer depended on tactical brilliance or operational daring. It depended on mathematics. The broader historical significance of the Ardennes lies not in the failure of a single offensive, but in what that failure revealed about modern warfare. Industrialized armies operate as systems. They convert fuel, time, maintenance capacity, and infrastructure into motion and firepower. When those inputs remain within tolerance, doctrine functions as intended. When they exceed tolerance, doctrine becomes descriptive rather than directive. In the Ardennes, armored warfare did not fail because tanks were obsolete or because commanders lacked imagination. It failed because the environment imposed constraints that could not be negotiated away. Roads could carry only so much weight. Bridges could support only so much mass. Crews could endure only so much fatigue. Communications could tolerate only so much delay before coherence dissolved. These limits existed everywhere in the war. What made the Ardennes distinct was that they aligned simultaneously. The so-called impossible defense line was not a product of genius or improvisation alone. It was the emergent result of allowing the enemy to commit fully to a plan whose success depended on conditions that could not be sustained. It accepted penetration in order to deny exploitation. It accepted loss in order to ensure irreversibility. It did not seek to stop the offensive immediately, but to ensure that once begun, it could not end any other way. This approach did not produce a dramatic moment of victory. It produced something quieter and more enduring: the absence of alternatives. By the time German forces began to withdraw, the decision had already been made by factors beyond command authority. The offensive did not fail at its furthest point of advance. It failed at the moment when continuing no longer produced new possibilities. From that point onward, action became routine, procedural, and ultimately irrelevant to the strategic balance. In the larger arc of the war, the Ardennes did not reverse Allied fortunes. Those had already been decided by industrial capacity, global logistics, and sustained pressure on multiple fronts. What it did demonstrate was how even a powerful, experienced force could be neutralized without decisive battle if it was induced to operate outside the limits its system could endure. That lesson would resurface repeatedly in later conflicts, under different names and technologies, but with the same underlying structure. Systems do not collapse when they are attacked at their strongest point. They collapse when they are pushed into conditions they were never designed to tolerate. In the winter forests of the Ardennes, that tolerance was exceeded not by overwhelming force, but by alignment of terrain, time, and constraint. And once aligned, those forces required no further intervention.